When preparing for an exam, many people choose to study by taking notes and reading them. The basic idea is that there's a bunch of scattered information one needs to know, and so notes are the tool that allows us to group and synthesize everything into a common and easily accessible resource that one can then review multiple times to memorize everything and ace the exam. And although this makes sense at first, it has a teeny tiny problem. It doesn't work. You see, the first problem is believing that reading our notes multiple times will somehow make us memorize better, or that in other words, reading is an effective form of repetition. But the fact of the matter is, it isn't. In fact, hundreds of published papers show time and time again that reading is probably the worst form of repetition there is. For instance, a study done by Rediger published in 2006 compared the effectiveness of repeating through bouts of reading instead of repeating through an alternative method. And as you can clearly see, the group that studied by reading multiple times, 14 to be precise, had the worst performance. 3 times worse to be exact. And in case you're wondering, the alternative method that showed to be better was repeating through retrieval. Retrieval, in case you don't know, is the effortful act of forcing our minds to remember the content we've already learned. Contrary to reading, retrieval doesn't just re-expose the mind to the content, it makes her generate the content, and that in turn strengthens the already created neural paths. In the study of Rediger, retrieval was accomplished by instructing participants to write everything they could remember about the text in a blank page. And that was it. That's everything they did. They weren't allowed to see the text, no feedback was given, no restudy opportunities happened, nothing. It was quite literally just trying to remember and writing it. And again, that produced results which were 3 times better. Now, the other problem with notes is that they prolong the latency between studying and repeating. And I want to be clear, this is not a huge deal if you're studying for, let's say, a small exam of your university with just a few subjects, but it does become a problem when you want to prepare for a huge exam, like the MCAT, the USMLE, MIR, MBE, and the like. And the problem is basically due to this, the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. Ebbinghaus, considered by many as the father of memory research, discovered hundreds of years ago that just weeks after learning a subject, we forget it. I know, shocking. But the important finding of Ebbinghaus was the solution. He realized that if you repeat the topic just before forgetting it, you effectively reset and prolong the forgetting curve. And if you do this enough times, the forgetting curve dilates so much that for all intents and purposes, you can think of the subject as memorized, at least memorized enough for your exam. However, as you can clearly see, the first few repetitions have to occur relatively early. First, a few days after learning the subject, then at least a couple of weeks after learning the subject, and then about a month after that. And if these earlier repetitions don't take place, the rest of the system simply collapses. Which is why you can learn a subject perfectly today and still forget it in a couple of months if you fail to practice it at the appropriate intervals. So with that in mind, the problem with taking notes is simple. They take too much time. Indeed, and even if you're a fast typer that writes something like 150 words per minute, you'll still take at least twice as long as it takes you to just read and process the content without taking the notes. And so let's say, for instance, that you learn 20 topics today. To remember those 20 topics, you have to repeat them in the coming days, right? Then in the coming weeks, and then in the coming month. And hey, if 20 subjects is all we're dealing with, well, no problem. But if on top of those 20 you have other 400 subjects you need to learn, hello USMLE, then we run into a problem. So for instance, if you try to take notes on everything and then begin your repetitions, we realize that by the time you start repeating, you've already forgotten like half of the things you learned. On the other hand, if you try to mix repetition sessions between the note-taking sessions, you realize that the amount of things you need to repeat in a couple of months becomes simply unmanageable. Whatever way you try to square this, you'll always bump yourself into the same wall, because taking notes simply takes too much time. Time you simply do not have when you're studying for a huge exam. And again, it's not that you can't have good results using this system, because you certainly can, and I'm sure that you can think of someone who does really well and also take notes. But have you ever considered that people sometimes get results not because of what they do, but in spite of what they do? I don't know, it's just something to keep in mind, especially when 9 out of 10 research papers support what I'm telling you. But hey, I know what you're thinking. If I don't take notes, then how else am I going to remember what I read? Well, I got 3 options for you. Option number 1, use question banks. Now, granted, these tend to be available just for standardized exams like the MCAT and the USMLE, but when they are available, they are hands down one of the best tools we have to study. And the reason they work so well is because they tend to repeat the important subjects over and over again in different ways. So you could, for example, very well answer a question about a topic today and have a totally different question but about the same topic in just a few days, and then in a few weeks, and then in a few other weeks, which, as you may have guessed, is exactly what we're looking for here. But you gotta keep in mind that for this to work, you have to do a high volume of questions, something like 40 and hopefully 60 or 80 questions a day. Because if you just do 10 questions a day and spend all of your time taking notes on the feedback of those few questions, you'll run into the same problem we had before. Now, option number 2 is using flashcards within applications such as Anki, and this also works flawlessly because these applications have built-in algorithms that make sure you repeat the information at the appropriate intervals. But again, keep in mind, for this to work, you actually have to do the flashcards at the appropriate intervals. If you just do what many people do, which is create thousands of cards and make each card look like a short notebook, then you just cannot keep up, and so you fail to repeat at appropriate intervals, and then we run into the same problem we had with the notes. So to avoid that from happening, always remember these 3 rules of thumb about good flashcards. 1. Not everything deserves to be a flashcard. 2. Many things can be figured out by logic and reasoning. And 3. Do not use your flashcards to take notes. Seriously. Okay, and finally we have option number 3, which is an option you actually heard before in this video, which is self-evaluation. So you remember the study of Rodiger? Yeah, well, just letting you know that you can do the exact same thing they did, but for your exams. So you just gotta take a piece of paper or a whiteboard or an iPad, and you gotta try to remember everything you learned about a topic and write it down. And that's it. You don't need any special programs, software, apps, nothing. And in fact, that's how I studied for many of my exams when I was a medical student. I first learned the subject with my books and platforms, then a couple of days later I grabbed my good old whiteboard and jotted down everything I learned about the subject, as if I were teaching it to a classmate, and then the day before the exam I would repeat the same process but with all of the subjects I'm about to get tested on. And that was it. Literally. Now, in all fairness, this probably won't be my method of choice to study for big exams like the USMLE, because again, it takes longer than just doing a high volume question approach, which I think is more efficient. But hey, if you're just looking for a way to study for your regular exams, this is a system that's much better than taking notes and reading them multiple times. 3 times better, in case you forgot. And yes, in case you were wondering, the final product of this self-evaluation looks a lot like notes, especially if you do them in a paper or in something like an iPad. But contrary to the previous system, the objective of these notes is not to store the information or to rely the processing of the information on the paper instead of your brain. No, the point of these notes is to use the paper as an excuse to force your mind to do retrieval. And that's why the system works. Which goes to show you that notes are not inherently bad. The problem comes when people try to use notes as a so-called second brain, leaving their first brain unattended. But here's a question for you. What if after this video you create like the best study system there is, like the perfect plan, but then you just don't get yourself to go through with it? Like you have the plan, you have the system, but you just don't do it. Then it was all for nothing, right? This happens to a lot of people, and it happens precisely because, just as James Clear says, you don't rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems. And unfortunately, the study systems or the study habits of most of us are simply non-existent. So what I recommend if you find yourself in this place is to hop on Skillshare and watch the class of Thomas Frank on real productivity, how to build habits that last. In this class, Thomas takes you through 10 lessons that provide an amazing insight into the art of building better habits. One of my favorite tips of the class, which is actually the title of the second lesson, is that perfect is the enemy of good. Because that's one thing I see all the time. People making these extremely convoluted systems to achieve their goals, trying to make the perfect plan, without realizing that sometimes the perfect plan is the one you're actually able to follow through. So I encourage you to watch this class and in general to check out Skillshare. It's honestly one of my favorite platforms to learn. I think it's amazing. It doesn't have ads, they have amazing classes of extremely high quality, you get access to world-renowned authors and teachers, and you can interact with them and leave them questions and create projects and receive feedback. Like honestly, it has everything. In fact, I like it so much that just last month I got motivated to post my own classes on the science of effective learning over there. And the best part is that if you want to check out anything I've said so far, like literally every class I've mentioned, you can do so for free. You just gotta use the link in the description and get a 1-month free trial, and then, just as Skillshare says, you can start exploring your creativity today. But anyways, thanks a lot Skillshare for sponsoring this video. Here's another video on study techniques you might find interesting, and I'll see you guys in the next one.